Good day and welcome to Nature's Returns, a webinar series hosted by the Yale Center for Business and the Environment. My name is Margaret Oliver and I will be your host for today's webinar titled Watershed Finance Models, Comparing Structure, Scalability, and Scope. The Nature's Returns webinar series invites leading practitioners and researchers in the field of conservation finance to talk about the latest opportunities and developments in the growing field of ecosystem service valuation and investment. In today's webinar, we will explore two water fund models that differ in both the types of watersheds that they seek to protect and the types of finance that they seek to leverage. We will then discuss the lessons learned from each model and compare their potential for scale and replication in different types of geographic settings. We will first hear from Spencer Meyer. Spencer will present his work with the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative, a collaborative water fund serving the greater Portland, Maine region, whose mission is to secure permanently the forests that naturally filter the drinking water for 1/6 of Maine residents. We will then hear from Ashley Allen Jones. Ashley will present her work with the Revolving Water Fund, an innovative conservation finance model that aligns the interests of farmers, conservationists, municipalities, regulators, and impact investors to advance conservation goals in the Brandywine-Christina watershed within the greater Delaware River Basin. After both of our presenters speak, we will transition into a conversation comparing the two models. Before we begin, we would like to remind our listeners that we welcome any questions that you might have, and we'll direct them to our speakers toward the end of the talk. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A window throughout the presentation. To open the webinar, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Spencer Meyer. Spencer Meyer is a conservationist at the Highstead Foundation and a co-founder of the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative. Spencer leads the Highstead Foundation's conservation science and finance programs and works with partners to identify opportunities to finance natural solutions and to environmental and social changes. Spencer is an associate at the Harvard Forest, is a co-leader with the Wildlands and Woodlands movement, and has published academic and popular articles on conservation, forestry, economics, and sustainability. Previously, Spencer has worked with the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies as a fellow with the Nature Conservancy's Global Science team, and for over a decade in Maine with academic, forest industry, and conservation partners. Spencer, welcome to Nature's Returns.
Margaret, thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here with you and Ashley to talk about just two of the many water funds that we've been learning about around the country and indeed around the globe. Really excited that so many people have registered for the webinar today, and really looking forward to some of the questions at the end. I only have around 15 minutes or so, and I'm trying to try to get through a lot, but I know we'll have some good discussion at the end where we can dig in a little deeper on some of the topics. So I'm tasked with first introducing the concept of water funds broadly, and then I'm going to talk to you all about Sebago Clean Waters. One example of a water fund, this one's based in Maine, where we're working together with conservation and business and utility partners to conserve a heavily forested watershed. Briefly, the Highstead Foundation is a family operating foundation based in Connecticut, and we work with conservation partners all around New England on advancing the wildlands and woodlands vision, as well as floricultural conservation for communities, as well as large landscapes. Highstead is one of the 9 major partners in the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative, and as everyone knows, these initiatives take a lot of partners and a lot of horsepower, and so just to reiterate, I'm here representing a broad group of really smart people that I'm excited to represent today. So generally speaking, the concept behind watershed funds is that watersheds are producing clean water for downstream users. The beneficiaries who are getting clean drinking water from their taps are not always the ones helping to produce the clean water upstream, particularly in landscapes that are heavily forested or are in agricultural landscapes, as we'll hear later from Ashley. And so the concept is to transfer some resources from downstream where the beneficiaries are, upstream to where many of the producers are. In this infographic from the Nature Conservancy, you can see here the life cycle of downstream water consumers generating funds and sending them upstream for the communities and land trusts, and often the private and sometimes public landowners. They're keeping the forests as forests that filter the water that goes downstream to where people are drinking the water from their taps. And as you'll see, this is very much embodied in the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative. The Nature Conservancy has a lot of very great resources, very helpful resources through their Global Water Funds team. And I'll point all of you to the Water Funds Toolbox that they have online. Here's an image showing, and this is, I think, within the last year or so, but there are about 35 water funds either created or in emerging status throughout the world. And as you'll see from Ashley and me comparing our two water funds, they really are quite different. There's no single model that embodies all water funds. And so there's a lot of different models. There are a lot of other partners in the conservation space that are involved in water funds as well. So look to your favorite partners for more information. One of the components of the toolbox that I've found very helpful is to think about the different phases in the life cycle of water funds. This graphic here shows a series of phases from feasibility through design, creation, operation, and maintenance of the water fund. I'll say it'll maybe become more clear later, but for Sebago Clean Waters, we're at the later end of the design phase and the early part of the creation phase. There, of course, are a lot of steps under each one of these. And again, if you go to the Water Funds Toolbox, you can see quite a bit more resources here for guiding you through each one of these phases. So Sebago Clean Waters is this partnership based in Maine where there's a filtration avoidance waiver from the EPA for the watershed and the drinking water system of Portland. The watershed itself is about 300,000 acres and is disconnected from the water system itself in Portland. Portland Water District is the lead water utility that supplies drinking water to about 11 towns around the greater Portland region, which includes about 1/6 of all Mainers who get their drinking water from this watershed. The watershed is heavily forested, about 84%. It's only about 10% protected from development right now, and it's heavily privately owned with just a little bit of the White Mountain National Forest in the very northwestern corner and some small state and local public lands elsewhere in the watershed. The watershed has been the municipal water source since 1869 and produces around 6.5 billion gallons of water, about 50% of which is for residential users, and 22% is taken up by the top 25 largest commercial users. Our partners in the initiative are two local land trusts, Loon Echo Land Trust and Western Foothills Land Trust, Casco Bay Estuary Partnership, Portland Water District, Open Space Institute, Lakes Environmental Association, Nature Conservancy, Trust of Public Land, and Highstead. These are the core founding partners that came together about 3 or so years ago, initially to craft a conservation action plan for the Crooked River, but have since expanded the scope of the project considerably to the whole Sebago watershed. One thing we're very fortunate to have to work with, and indeed this is one thing that makes us pretty different than other water funds, is that the main water utility in this watershed has already been contributing to land protection for about a decade. The Portland Water District, led here by Paul Hunt and Laurel Jackson in the Lands and Watershed program, have been able to make contributions to land trust projects up to 25% of the value of doing those conservation deals. So we formed this partnership on the backs of that history, indeed to accelerate the growth of that conservation. Here's a recent graph we've just produced looking at rate of land protection in terms of acres of forest conserved in the watershed. And you can see it's been very sporadic over time, going back to the 2000. And the number of partners involved in the watershed have varied considerably over time. What we aim to do is to bring together these Sebago Clean Waters partners to increase the annual forest protection to ensure the future drinking water is secured. Open Space Institute has a great resource in form of a meta-analysis of scientific literature showing why forest cover is so important for drinking water. So if you look at the y-axis here, you see the percent of a watershed that's in either forest, agriculture, or developed area. And the range of conditions shown by the shapes on the graph show the acceptable levels of each of those that lead to clean drinking water in those watersheds. The Sebago watershed conditions are shown here in these dashed lines. So we're about 84% forested, as I said now, and around 10% or a little less in developed status. The risk in this watershed is a reduction in the forest cover and an increase in development cover. New England overall is losing about 24,000 acres of forest every year through largely rural and suburbanization, perforations in the forest, mostly through residential housing development, transmission lines. And this is a watershed that is at risk of that because its high nature of privately owned forest land. So the way we've approached developing a water fund on these basic principles is to first understand the needs of the communities. And that means both upstream in the watershed, these tend to be rural, low population watersheds that are helping to produce the water, and the downstream urban and urbanizing communities that have different needs, different beneficiaries, and different financial resources. We've undertaken a lot of science and planning, and I should say that there have been quite a few organizations over the years that have worked in this watershed, including the green-gray infrastructure analysis that World Resources Institute has done in this watershed has been really helpful to our work. It's been an area of interest because of this EPA filtration avoidance waiver. We've also done economic and ecosystem service study to understand the financial underpinnings of this watershed. I'll say more about that. And then, of course, we're thinking a lot about funding, both for our operations, but then how our project will lead to new funding to conserve more forest land. So each of our core partners is putting funding into this through both cash and in-kind contributions. We have an additional anonymous foundation, and we have a really important seed money from the U.S. Endowment, EPA, and NRCS in the Healthy Watersheds Consortium program. Increasingly, we have breweries and other businesses that have begun chipping in as well that I'll say more about. And just this past year, we were able to use the state revolving funds for the first time to finance some of the conservation. Early on, we really focused a lot on the conservation impact and how to measure our impact. And so we have a data tool we've developed from best available information on everything from important habitat for wildlife and plant species, the development threat within the watershed. And we worked with scientists in other organizations, as well as the University of Maine and some previous projects to really understand the full suite of conservation benefits for this watershed. Now that we have that tool, we'll be using that to prioritize funding of projects going forward. Here is a quick snapshot of the ecosystem service analysis that we've done in the watershed, including habitat, recreation, air quality, fiber production for timber, sediment, phosphorus, and nitrogen retention for water quality, and carbon sequestration associated with the ongoing climate crisis. And we have a good handle on what each of these is worth. On average, it's between $300 and $2,000 per acre per year of forest that is conserved within the watershed. If you're interested in a lot of the underlying modeling work and economic analysis, on our website is this economic case white paper you see here. We also have done the future land use trajectory scenarios to understand where and what the likelihood of different levels of forest loss would be. For example, we know that an 8% forest loss could result in the loss of the filtration avoidance waiver because in the reduction of nutrient sediment and phosphorus retention within the watershed. Which in short looks something like this. We know the protection costs around $950 per acre, one-time payment, but we know the benefits are on average $800 per acre per year. And this is accrued in water quality, air pollution, climate regulation in particular, but many of those other benefits I mentioned. We know that losing 8% forest cover could trigger a minimum of 40% increase in the pollution that leads to loss of drinking water quality. We know if that happens, it's been estimated that Portland Water District would have to spend on the order of $150 million one time to build a filtration plant, as well as another $13 million per year in operating expenses. This would lead to an increase of about 84% in the commercial water rates. So if we look at the water user data now, we know for just the top 50 water users alone, that's about $2.5 million per year in increased costs associated with that loss of filtration avoidance waiver. If you look across all the utilities customers, that's $15 million per year. In essence, conserving the forest and keeping the water quality the way it is avoiding $15 million per year increased water rates for these consumers. So what we've been doing is taking this value proposition and some associated ones and putting them into marketing materials that we can take to the business community. Here's just a screenshot of one of them. This one's focused on the business community. We have a water, convey to them what the particular value propositions from their perspective is. Here's the inside that enumerates the various benefits that we see accruing to them. And I won't go through each one of these, but if anyone's interested, I can point you to these marketing materials that we've developed. Essentially, it's a call to action for the business community to be co-investing in the watersheds because it behooves not only the communities and the public and their employees, but the businesses themselves through operating costs, supply chains, et cetera. I want to highlight just one early success we've had. Just this past December, two of our core partners, the Trust for Public Land and Loon Echo Land Trust, closed on a 1,400-acre working forest that was privately owned and is now owned by the Loon Echo Land Trust and managed as a community forest for the benefit of the town of Sebago, which is within the watershed. This was an early flagship project for the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative. It really brings together a lot of the important on-the-ground conservation benefits for water quality and was the first showpiece we could bring to our various benefactors for this project. We've also had a lot of traction with the brewery community. Of course, this has been done in a lot of places around the country, but in this case, we've had really great luck bringing the community of breweries, not just individual breweries, together to showcase the importance of this work for their most important ingredient. This last May, during Drinking Water Week, we had, I think, 12 breweries host staff and partners from our partner organizations to be in the tap rooms celebrating the connection between forests and clean drinking water. We've also had a few of the breweries produce special beers, shown here in one example, specifically for Sebago Clean Waters. So I'm going to close with just a couple of lessons learned, and I know we'll have a lot more time in question and answers. It's been very important for us as a coalition of 9 core organizations with really big, I'll call it asymmetry between the capacity of the partners. Everything from very small, lightly staffed land trusts onto international environmental NGOs is really challenging to work across the different levels of capacity. So we've established a working principles agreement for all the partners that we all adhere to and really provide the ground rules and guidance when conflicts do arise. I think the capacity to collaborate in itself has been a real success story for us so far beyond the specific goals of conserving forest. We've heard from a number of our partners, particularly the smaller ones, how much the capacity of all these organizations sitting around the table has emboldened them to do the work they do and to go after new opportunities they might not have gone after otherwise. An important lesson we're learning and continuing to learn is really adapting the relatively slow pace of the NGO world that we work in to the fast pace of the business community. And sometimes that means being at the right place at the right time when the right company is looking for the right new initiative. And we're really learning how to do that. Also really addressing conflict when it does arise, whether it's between partners internally or often with external organizations who maybe want to become a partner or looking how to build on the success of this initiative themselves. And finally, the value propositions that we go in with sometimes to the business community is not always the value proposition that we leave with. Very early on in the project, we did a series of stakeholder interviews to understand what moves some of these businesses that are heavily reliant on drinking water, and we guided our value proposition materials with that. However, that hasn't always turned out to be the case. And there have been some real surprises about what it is that compels a business to want to support us or want to hear, have another meeting and go the next step. And so it's important to be flexible and nimble as we think about that. So with that, I will close and thank many of our early adopters, including some of the breweries and our core funding. And I look forward to hearing from Ashley. And lastly, I would just like to say thank you to our core staff made up of independent consultants, Stacy Cramp, Marcy Lyman, Karen Young, and Naomi Merman, who have been really central to giving the volunteer partners lots of capacity to move this whole initiative forward. So thank you to all of them.
Great. Thank you so much, Spencer, for your talk. Now we will shift to Ashley's talk in just a moment. But I just wanted to give a reminder for those of you just joining us, Spencer has just finished presenting his work with the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative. And at this time, we would like to again remind you that we welcome any questions that you might have, and we'll direct them to our speakers towards the end of the talk. Please type your questions directly into the Q&A box throughout the presentation. Now we will transition to hear from our next speaker, Ashley Allen Jones. Ashley will present her work with the Revolving Water Fund, an innovative conservation finance model that advances conservation goals in the Brandywine-Christina watershed within the Greater Delaware Basin. As a pioneer in impact investing, Ashley Allen Jones is committed to breaking traditional financial models that separate social and financial returns and aligning capital behind commercial enterprises whose core business activities generate positive social or environmental impact. She is the founder of I2 Capital, where she focuses on the creation and development of innovative revolving fund vehicles to expand private investment in conservation. To that end, she co-founded the Revolving Water Fund and the Upper Green River Conservancy private enterprises that develop and market ecosystem assets in partnership with farmers and ranchers. Ashley, welcome to Nature's Returns.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Spencer, for giving that wonderful introduction to the big concept of water funds. Agreed, there's a lot of really fantastic work going on around the country and around the world, and our efforts are absolutely building on the work that the Nature Conservancy and many others have done in advancing the concept of environmental assets. So I just wanted to add a few overriding thoughts as we get started with my presentation in relation to Spencer's. So I think a big effort that everyone in the field of conservation and conservation finance has made, continues to make over the last, say, decade and up until today is the notion of quantifying the value of environmental assets. Right, and that takes a number of different forms. It could take the form of a conservation bank or a mitigation bank, which are regulated entities that have credit certified. It could take the lens of a protocol, as the carbon markets have taken over time. But the bottom line is the ability to quantify what heretofore has been a free asset. I like to call this tackling the tragedy of the commons, because in capitalist economic theory, and actually socialist economic theory since the beginning of time, we haven't really incorporated the cost of water, air, biodiversity, and other what we think of as public assets into our means of production. And so that's the big challenge that we're trying to tackle, and doing it in different ways. And I come at this from very much a finance practitioner standpoint, although I've learned a whole lot about environmental regs in the last several years, more than I maybe should know, and about the science of conservation, because it takes expertise in all of those arenas to be able to put these solutions together, as Spencer said. So just as I dive into my presentation, I think we should all think about the amount of capital that we need to solve these solutions, the amount of capital that's currently being spent to solve these solutions, the gap between those two numbers, which is huge, and then the interventions and motivations that we can use to incentivize the investment of more money. So a lot of what Spencer talked about was risk reduction, right? There's the scenario of if we don't do this now, this is what will happen later. Think of it as preventative health. Unfortunately, we're not very great at preventative health in this country. We're certainly not very great at preventative conservation, but that's the notion. That's one of the big notions here, that there's a huge risk coming our way, and if we don't do something about it quickly, it's going to be a really, really horrible scenario. So you hear those arguments. The other arguments that I think about a lot are, how do we increase profitability, right? So if you're running a corporation, if you're a corporate water manager, you're basically thinking about how are you going to run your operation with less money? How are you going to increase your profits or reduce your costs? And so what we're doing in the Revolving Water Fund is looking very closely at the economics of water utility processing, and a lot of people are doing work on this around the globe. I'm constantly scouring for really good case studies, so if anyone has them, please send them our way. Maybe we can share. But so increase in profit, reduction in cost is a big incentive for investment. And then the final incentive, which is really what we've used to date in the United States, is a regulatory hammer. So if you have a TMDL that you have to meet, or a municipality has to meet its MS4 obligations, it's going to have to spend money anyway. And so our objective is, how do we make that money be spent more efficiently, effectively? So with that rather broad brush introduction, I will dive into, I think I have about 10 slides here. So our project is, let me just go back here for a moment because I want to be sure to point out, our project is in the Brandywine-Christina watershed, which is one of the 8 sub-watersheds of the Delaware River Basin. And this project really sits under the umbrella of a much larger project, which is advanced by the William Penn Foundation, called the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. This is a $100+ million project that the William Penn Foundation is leading across the entire Delaware River Basin to tackle conservation. And are we okay, Emmy? Okay. And so with really comprehensive backing from the William Penn Foundation, as well as investment from the NRCS Conservation Innovation Grants Program, and investment from DuPont and I2 Capital, and a lot of sweat equity investment from all the people that are working on this project, we've been able to put together a pretty interesting partnership. So let me dive into the details. So the slide that you can see right here is the Brandywine-Christina watershed. It's in northwestern Delaware, southeastern Pennsylvania, covers 2 states, drinking water for 600,000 people. There are several water utilities that are at both within the watershed and at the bottom of the watershed. It's a highly fragmented environment, meaning lots of small communities across Pennsylvania and Delaware, and most importantly, very productive farm agricultural region. And all of that comes into play when we think about how we're putting this, how we're advancing this project. Unfortunately, the majority of the watershed is impaired, and it has been impaired for quite some time under the Federal Clean Water Act. And so the state of Pennsylvania and the states of Pennsylvania and Delaware have various stages of TMDL plans and MS4 plans, which I'm assuming most people on this call know what that is, but regulatory constructs under which everyone's trying to clean the water in these watersheds. So again, agriculture accounts for 80% of the nutrient loads. Agriculture is the major activity in this watershed, and it accounts for the majority of the pollutants. And that is not by way of holding out the agricultural sector as a bad actor. It's just by way of saying this is the fact in this watershed, that agricultural production is the main source. And importantly, that's a non-point source pollutant, which makes it more difficult to track, measure, and clean up. But those are the facts that we're dealing with. The municipalities within this watershed all tend to be relatively small, and they are constrained with respect to their budgets. And our thesis, based on a lot of research, is that tackling the agricultural production methods and operations on farms with agricultural best management practices is a really efficient and effective way to address the water quality issues and other conservation issues across the watershed. So there's a lot of analysis out there about the cost of doing agricultural pollutant reduction versus more urban infrastructure, gray infrastructure, water projects. This is a very clear argument to make, but it doesn't necessarily lead to an immediate switch from one solution to the other solution. And part of that is because of the way that municipalities and governments, government entities, political entities make decisions. And part of it is because we're just still in the early stages of this. So sources of conservation funding, what we're trying to do with this effort is rather than have grant funding from federal, USDA, federal sources, foundation, corporate, state grants, et cetera, rather than making the case for additional grant funding, we're trying to actually create a quantified market-based solution wherein we produce units of pollution reduction outcome, and those units can then be marketed to off-takers. And that marketing process right now is really, in a business context, it's based on the second two things that I pointed out at the beginning of this talk. So either increase profits, reduce costs, or meeting regulatory obligations. So if and when we pull this off, hopefully when we pull this off, what it creates is a revolving pool of funding, because you can have investment come in from conservation investors who are interested in supporting this innovation. You can use that capital to invest in agricultural best management practices. You can quantify the benefits of the practices that you put into the ground. You can negotiate offtake contracts, and you can theoretically cover your cost of capital and your operating costs and return what I would caution as a modest amount back into a pooled funding vehicle where you have a sustained loop. And that's nirvana, because at that point, we have pools of conservation capital that are building on themselves and continuing to be reinvested instead of sort of one way out. As Spencer said, I cannot underscore enough the partnership requirements for these efforts to advance. You know, it's a combination of expertise across finance, conservation, environmental markets, quantification, regulation, legal, science. It takes all of those facets of operation to allow a solution like this to happen. So it's certainly not just a raise some money, turn the switch, and voila, you've got a revolving fund. I would point out the really incredible partnerships that we have with Stroud Water Research, which is arguably one of the top water science organizations in the country, if not the world. We've worked really closely and continue to do so with the water regulators in the state of Delaware and the state of Pennsylvania. That picture of Pennsylvania is Lee Murphy, who runs the MS4 water program in Pennsylvania. I call him out because he's been extraordinary in working closely with us on this project. And then we're working with the leaders of municipalities and the managers of water companies about what their regulatory requirements are, what their operating costs are, et cetera. So I'm not going to go into detail on this. You can perhaps look at it on the after slides, but this is fundamentally just, this is to underscore that these are simultaneous work streams that are happening. under the management and leadership of each of the people that you saw on the last page. These work streams are happening simultaneously, and they have to align so that we get to an ultimate aligned solution. And this is just some of the conservation supply activities that these are probably common terms for many of you in the environmental sector in terms of the actual implementation of cover crops, buffers, forest, open space, headwaters, et cetera. Conservation demand activities are really much more about MBA finance cases, which the MBA is on the phone, and the Yale School of Environment Management students will probably jump into. And then the regulatory compliance, we spoke on this well, pretty much any time I speak on this now, I really underscore the regulatory compliance activities and the importance of having a regulatory construct in place to support these markets, because without some level of regulatory impetus, they can only scale so far, in my opinion. So that is the end of my presentation. Hopefully we didn't go over too long, and please feel free to reach out to me. I know we have an incredible audience online today, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to share our work.
Thank you so much, Ashley, for your talk. Now we'll shift to a conversation between the three of us about the different types, or about the differences between these models and their potential for replication across different types of watersheds. And then we will move to answer some of the questions from the audience. We have received quite a few, so we won't be able to answer them all, but we will try to answer as many as we can. So to begin this conversation, I would like to start by comparing the physical aspects of each of these watersheds. And it is clear from your presentations that the two watersheds have quite different starting points from an ecological standpoint. So I wanted to ask how the initial environmental risk factor that each of you are trying to solve led to the strategies that you're trying to use in each of these water funds.
Ashley, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, as I just said, the watershed where we're focusing our development work is a very agriculturally rich watershed, and non-point source pollutants running off of agricultural production operations are the main challenge in this watershed, and in many similar watersheds across the Mid-Atlantic and in the Midwest and some in California. And some of the Southeast. So if you have an agricultural rich watershed where small production operations are causing major pollutants, it leads you to think about what we can do to enhance the pollutant reduction capacities of those agricultural operations. And I would point out that NRCS is probably the largest funder of ag-based pollution reduction or effective ag management practices in the country. They do really great work. They reach 15% of the private landownings. And so 85% of our agricultural lands have no interaction with NRCS. Some of that's cultural, political, but a lot of it is just capacity. There's just not enough capacity to tackle these challenges at scale. And that's one of the reasons that NRCS has been so involved in these innovative new efforts to try to expand the scale of conservation capital. So is that?
Yeah, that is great. Spencer, is there anything you would like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that the watershed is quite different in that, I mean, to put it simply, things are pretty good the way they are. And the goal of this initiative is to keep things the way they are, which as Ashley articulated earlier, that's a really challenging thing to do because we as a country tend to respond to crises. And the reality is there isn't a crisis happening tomorrow or the next day. We don't know how far off it is, but small sort of death by 1,000 cut residential, particularly rural second home amenity-based development is a serious threat to Sebago watershed. As Portland, Maine has a renaissance of sorts and continues to grow rapidly, the suburbanization pressure that's emanating north and west from the city is very significant. At the same time, second home development in the ski towns and some of the other places in the upper watershed for recreation amenities and view sheds and things like that is really desirable. And so the forest now at 84% forested is just fine. And as Paul Hunt at the Portland Water District is fond of saying, the lake is so big and clean that there's about 100 years of perfectly good water sitting in the lake right now at the rate that they use it. And so the challenge for us is to compel people to act and invest now for something that may not be realized or avoided, more importantly, into the future. But it's really about loss of forest land, which through some of our other work in wildlands and woodlands, we know very acutely is happening in this watershed as well as New England more broadly. Another important thing to remember is that much of New England is expected to be a climate refuge as other parts of the country become less hospitable, particularly as water is limiting, not just drinking water, but water broadly is limiting elsewhere. And water broadly, not just drinking water, is not expected to be limiting in our region. And so these places are experiencing development pressure now, will have greater potential risk in the future. And so it's really this working with private landowners to conserve their land voluntarily, I should say. I did notice there were a couple of questions about this, that at the end of the day, what we're talking about is voluntary forest conservation, either through private landowners who wish to sell their land to a land trust or otherwise, or more often through conservation easements where the landowner can continue to live and manage their land as they see fit, but that the rest of the region can be ensured that the forest will stay as forest.
Thank you, Spencer. One clear difference that we have seen between your two mechanisms that you've outlined is that one is a market-based mechanism in the case of Ashley's, whereas the other is not. So I was wondering if Ashley, if you could elaborate more on the situations in which it is appropriate and feasible to take the leap into a market mechanisms and share any advice that you have for those who are looking to implement these sort of strategies in their watersheds.
Sure. So first and foremost, I think that there are two immediate opportunities for a market-based solution. Again, one is a regulated solution, meaning there is a regulation in place that says you have to do X, Y, Z, or you will get hit with fines or you will be out of compliance. And so a lot of our work, again, is integrating our solution with the regulatory frameworks in Pennsylvania and Delaware. And that is no small feat, but there's a lot of expertise out there at environmental regs. And it's a matter of aligning that expertise and building the will of the regulators to work beyond where we are right now to drive a regulated solution. And one of the interesting documents that came out in February of 2019 that probably a lot of people on this call have read was a memo issued by the Assistant Administrator of the EPA, David Ross, that is encouraging market-based solutions. So that's from the very top, right? There's a lot of support for market-based solutions. It gets complicated when you watch the transition or lack of transition from the senior-most vision down to how does this actually operate at a state level? How does this actually operate at a municipal level? So I'd say a regulatory, a reasonable regulatory construct is one requirement. The other opportunity is a voluntary market opportunity. And I think, Spencer, you've got a bit of a voluntary market opportunity, right? Because you're making the business case for the municipalities, for the public beneficiaries. We're just trying to crank that down a little more so that there's actually a cost-benefit business case. But I think that a lot of these efforts will remain here to, in the foreseeable future, there will need to be a voluntary purchase component to them. And we're seeing that happen across the country, across the globe. There's some really huge announcements that have happened in the last 2 weeks about, Microsoft going carbon negative and Delta going carbon neutral, and some of the big agricultural companies starting to invest in these solutions. So, but it's a lot of pieces that are going to have to come together, and more money is going to have to be spent, period, right? I mean, it's just more money is going to have to be spent. We're going to have to take money from where it's being spent elsewhere and put it into this. That's the bottom line, or you don't have a market. You don't
Yeah.
have a market. Because again, it's a tragedy of the commons. We haven't valued this asset, the asset of conservation. We haven't valued it historically. And what we're trying to say is, no, it's no longer free. Please help us to put a value on it before we actually are in the catastrophic situation of fill in the blank. So
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ashley. Moving back towards Spencer's model, I wanted to say, Spencer, before we move on to the questions and the answers from the audience, you mentioned that your water fund has had some early successes and related to capacity building. And then I wanted you to elaborate on those successes and as well as the pace of seeing results in a water fund project's development, and also how you measure the water fund success in the long term.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think the Tiger Hill Community Forest project that I pointed to is one very tangible on-the-ground success. That's 1,400 acres that is now in conservation ownership that will never be developed. And there was one question in the chat area about what the rural benefits are and of landowners conserving the land. In this case, it is a community forest being managed by and for the people of that particular town that otherwise did not have very much open space themselves. And so while it's owned by the land trust, it is managed for the community benefit. So that's one example of how the needs of a rural community are being directly addressed through this. I think that the asymmetry I talked about earlier of the partners, I mean, we have everyone from Western Foothills Land Trust, a very small but very impactful outfit, on up to the Nature Conservancy, and then a bunch of us in the middle in terms of financial and staff capacity. Getting all together and sitting around a table, we've seen over and over helps people that otherwise would not do things get excited about doing things. And sometimes that means we walk down a project together, and it shares capacity from big organizations to relatively small organizations. At the same time, it grounds the big organizations in what they're doing in the real needs of the small organizations who themselves really have the deep relationships in the communities. And so that's very sort of big picture and hand wavy, but I just can't overstate the value of that in our partnership. Another one is that in a somewhat related project, the U.S. Endowment and Highstead and Portland Water District have sort of been exploring the concept of using the state revolving funds for these so-called sponsorship projects, which is a whole other webinar topic for another day. And though we have not been successful in establishing the sponsorship project itself yet in Maine, what happened is through those series of discussions, what we learned is that the drinking water sponsorship program had some excess money that was earmarked for loans for land protection, but land trusts were not taking out loans because they didn't necessarily have a revenue stream to pay it back. So through a series of conversations, the state program decided to turn that into an opportunity for loan forgiveness, still for land protection, for some borrowers of these loans. At the same time, Portland Water District, who has been earmarking funds for contributing to conservation for quite a few years now, has been doing more and more every year, and is now comfortable with their long-term commitment to this initiative, that they decided to stretch their money further by actually bonding this land conservation funding in the same way they bond pipes every year, the same way they do substations and all those other gray infrastructure things that they've been bonding forever. They are now choosing to bond some conservation projects. And so it takes the same amount of money and stretches it considerably further. And so that's one of the ways we're trying to stretch the resources of all the partners. And that has happened because this group has come together, each with their own perspectives on this, and kind of walk down this together.
Great, thank you. We do have some questions from the audience. The first one is directed towards Ashley. And this person asks, can you clarify the financial structure of the revolving fund? More specifically, is it an endowment? Who manages it? And how does cash flow rise to replenish the revolving fund?
Sure, I'll answer that at a somewhat high level. So right now, the revolving water fund is, again, it's a partnership between I2 Capital and the Nature Conservancy. We have got money running through a private LLC that is managed by I2 Capital, and we also have funds running through the Nature Conservancy that are not-for-profit grant grant funds. And so it's a bit of a hybrid at the moment. Ultimately, the entity that manages the water fund will be a private finance entity, whether that's a, my guess is it'll be a public benefit corp, and it will be capitalized with a blended capital stack. So you've probably heard that term before, blended finance. It's, this is not a private equity business model. This is not a venture capital business model. This is a business model that is innovative, that is going to require likely some first loss risk capital alongside some catalytic capital, alongside some program related capital. If we get to true commercial capital, that would be great. We're going to have to see we're going to have more market uptake, just being quite frank, in the offtake purchases. And I'm getting to the end of the question. So the fund is replenished because you produce an environmental product, an environmental asset that is then sold for an exchange of revenue, and the revenue is then used to, the same way you would sell a piece of software and put it back into the operating company, right? The revenue is refunds the operating company, covers modest operating costs, a modest cost of capital, and then refunds back into the pool. So we're still working through final structures, but this is really a business operation in terms of it needs investment skills, legal skills, regulatory skills, and business development, product sales skills. Not to say that those skills aren't inherent across many different types of organizations, but the reason we have it in a revolving water fund construct is because it really is a fund vehicle that operates somewhat like an operating company, and refunds its own capital through that process.
Great, thank you so much. Spencer, can you say more about, we have another question from the audience, and they're asking you to elaborate more about the different value propositions that have worked for different businesses, and what have some of those surprises have been?
Sure. Yeah, so I think we would love to think that the avoided cost of future increases in water was enough to carry the day. But when you look at the total cost of water in a large business's operating budget, it's not always that big for some of the businesses. And it's not that big for some of the biggest businesses. For some of the smaller businesses, it is a significant portion. But for the businesses that have the capacity to really make a huge difference individually, it may not be. And so we have to be careful about that. And I ran through some of those numbers earlier. I think the importance of employee satisfaction and employee perception about their employer's investment in the communities in which they live has turned out to be a really interesting one. A lot of the companies have expressed a desire to be involved in projects that their employees are very aware of, that are very visible, and that the employees recognize as corporate contributions to the quality of life in their communities. Now, sometimes that's directly in the Portland region itself, and sometimes that's in a broader community where employees may recreate or choose to commute from in the upper watershed. The recreation opportunities in this watershed are really, really important and frankly undervalued. If you think about the massive recreation outdoor economy that we know a lot about in this region elsewhere, it's on the backs of conservation land. That's where people go to fish and hunt and recreate and hike. And so the value associated with having companies who can attract employees because there are recreation opportunities not too far away is an important one. Another one is seemingly unrelated corporate sustainability initiatives. Things like LEED certification, for example, can be compelling, and drawing the connection between sustainable water resources and LEED certification is an interesting angle. So we've heard a number of things that were not part of our original value proposition that we've begun to expand. I wanted to comment also on the fund structure, if I may, Emmy, because I saw some comments in there about that. Yes, it's true. We are a philanthropic model at this point. And I would say that's our short and midterm game. Our long game is to have a market-based mechanism, whether it's voluntary or otherwise, that is sort of a sustainable revolving approach. And we've discussed a number of those, but we don't think we can quite get there until we've really nailed down the suite of value propositions in the voluntary context. The regulatory hammer cuts both ways. If you have one, it's easier to build, not easy, but easier to build a mechanism on it, but it means something went wrong to have that regulation in the first place.
Yep.
And in our case, there isn't a regulation. That's the EPA filtration waiver that we have to work with. So our long game is to have a market mechanism, but for now we're a philanthropic structure, and we have been bringing in contributions in a fiscal agent sense. So some of our partner organizations are able to provide fiscal agent services to the rest of the partners, and thereby reducing the cost of receiving that money. So some of our partners are NGOs that are busy trying to raise money on their own. And some of us are organizations that don't necessarily need to do that. And so we each have unique roles to play in that structure. Open Space Institute is able to host the fund. They have this service for a lot of their partners around the region, is able to host a temporary fund in essence. Important to us is that the beneficiaries of this concept have an interest in designing the eventual legal structure. And so we've left the door open for that legal structure to be governed by not just the conservation NGOs at the table, but the broader business community.
Great. Thank you so much.
Could I just make one other important, I know it's not a question, but
of course.
It's a point that Spencer made, and I want to make it again because it's really, really important. There's a lot of work going on right now in addition to quantifying the benefits for the end users, meaning the water companies, the public, the corporates, utilities, et cetera. There's a lot of work going on to quantify the benefits to the farmers. And that's a really important piece of this, because farmers who are stewards of their land should benefit from being stewards of their land. And so the effort to analyze from a resource use perspective, and also to add actual financial incentives that go back to the farmers are underway. And none of this happens without close collaboration and cooperation with the hardworking women and men who are on the ground putting agriculture into the land. And so I just wanted to make sure to make that point.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley. We have so many questions that we are unable to answer as we are now wrapping up our webinar, but I will direct those questions to Ashley and Spencer with the names attached to them, and they may get back in touch with you over the course of the next week if they think that they can come up with a good answer. So thank you so much, Spencer and Ashley. And before we wrap up, do either of you have any final comments?
Well, just I would just
Go ahead.
I would just put my take my hat off, put my hand out to everyone who's on this call, because there are so many people working so hard on these really complex challenges, and we're all in it together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that the Conservation Finance Network published a great report on developing a market framework a year or so ago. And one of the great figures in there shows just how long these finance mechanisms take to create, whether they're regulatory or not. And wetland mitigation is the example they used. And, it takes decades to really mature these things. And so in the meantime, I just want to reiterate the importance of the catalytic capital that's largely coming from foundations and federal grants in this country that allow this kind of work to go. It takes a lot of care and feeding to manage and evolve these partnerships. But if you don't invest that time and money in them, you never get to the point where you have a sustainable solution. So I want to reiterate the importance of that. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you all so much again. So that concludes our webinar on watershed finance models. Ashley and Spencer, thank you again. To view a recording of this webinar, please visit the Events tab on the Yale Center for Business and the Environment website, or access the recording through our Yale iTunes University podcast. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, this is Margaret Oliver from the Yale Center for Business and the Environment.